By the middle of the 19th century, America had convinced itself of something enormous, that its expansion across an entire continent was not conquest, not opportunism, not the displacement of nations who already lived there, but destiny. Manifest destiny. A phrase coined by a journalist in 1845, yet somehow it felt older than the country itself, as if God had drawn the borders in advance and merely waited for Americans to arrive and claim them. This is the story of how a republic born proclaiming that all men are created equal spent the next century deciding, again and again, who counted as men at all, pushing indigenous nations from ancestral homelands, fighting a war with Mexico historians still argue was manufactured, and finally turning its own contradiction inward in a civil war that killed more Americans than every other American war combined. And then, remarkably, it rebuilt the myth once more, emerging from its bloodiest chapter not chastened, but somehow more convinced than ever of its own righteous destiny, just in time to step onto the world stage as an emerging global power. The end of Part 1 left the young United States with a workable constitution, a contradiction over slavery baked into its foundations, and a vast, only partially explored continent stretching to its west. What followed across the next 8 decades was not a story of steady, peaceful growth, as the phrase westward expansion often implies in classroom retellings, but one of the most sustained and consequential displacements in modern history, carried out under a banner of providential entitlement. The term manifest destiny itself was coined in 1845 by journalist John O'Sullivan, who wrote that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. The phrase caught fire because it gave a comforting name to something already well underway. Since the earliest colonial period, and accelerating dramatically after independence, the United States government pursued a policy, sometimes through treaty, more often through coercion, broken agreements, and outright warfare, of removing indigenous nations from lands east of the Mississippi and pushing them westward. The most notorious single episode came in 1830, when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act under President Andrew Jackson, authorizing the forced relocation of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations from the southeastern United States. The Cherokee case is particularly damning to the mythology of American law as a neutral, protective force. The Cherokee Nation actually sued the state of Georgia and won at the Supreme Court in 1832, with Chief Justice John Marshall ruling their sovereignty must be respected. President Jackson is reported, likely apocryphally but tellingly, to have responded that Marshall had made his ruling. Now let him enforce it. Roughly 16,000 Cherokee were marched over 1,000 miles west in the winter of 1838 to 39 under military escort, and an estimated 4,000 died along what became known as the Trail of Tears, from cold, disease, and starvation. This was not a rogue military action but the deliberate, congressionally authorized policy of a constitutional republic that simultaneously celebrated itself as a nation of laws. Expansion continued westward through purchase, negotiation, and war. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, in which Jefferson bought roughly 828,000 square miles from France, doubled the nation's size at a stroke, though it is worth noting Jefferson privately doubted his constitutional authority to make the purchase at all, a rare moment of a founding father's own doubts about the document he had helped inspire. Oregon was secured through negotiation with Britain. Texas, Mexico, and the vast Southwest were acquired through a war that many contemporaries, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, publicly questioned as unjustly provoked. President James K. Polk claimed Mexican forces had shed American blood upon American soil, using this to secure a declaration of war in 1846, but the exact location of the incident lay in disputed territory both nations claimed, and Lincoln, then a first-term representative, introduced his famous spot resolutions, demanding Polk identify precisely which spot of undisputedly American soil had been violated. Polk never answered. The war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico ceded roughly half its territory, modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, for a payment widely seen at the time, and since as a token gesture attached to what was in substance a war of territorial conquest. This continental expansion was not merely a backdrop to American history. It was the engine generating the central crisis that would soon consume the nation. Every new territory raised an unavoidable question. Would it enter as a free state or a slave state? The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 were all attempts to answer this question through legislative bargaining, and each attempt only deepened the sectional divide rather than resolving it. Kansas in particular descended into an undeclared civil war of its own in the mid-1850s, so violent it earned the name Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and free state settlers fought and killed one another over which constitution the territory would adopt. The mythology surrounding the Civil War that followed is perhaps the most contested piece of the entire American historical narrative, and remains actively disputed in American political life today. For roughly a century after the war ended in 1865, a powerful counter-narrative took hold in much of the South and was absorbed nationally through textbooks, monuments, and popular culture. The Lost Cause, which held that the war had been fought primarily over states' rights and constitutional principle, not slavery, and that the Confederacy's defeat was a noble, tragic loss rather than the collapse of a rebellion explicitly organized to preserve human bondage. This narrative is directly contradicted by the primary sources of the period itself. The declarations of secession issued by South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, and other seceding states explicitly and repeatedly cite the preservation of slavery as their central grievance. Mississippi's declaration states outright that its position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, in his 1861 Cornerstone speech, declared the new Confederate government's foundations rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery was his natural and normal condition. The states' rights framing emerged largely in the post-war decades as a way for the defeated South, and eventually the reunified nation as a whole, to reconcile without confronting what the war had actually been fought to defend. The war itself killed an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 Americans, more than all other American wars combined up to and including the 20th century, out of a national population of roughly 31 million, a casualty rate that, applied to today's population, would mean several million deaths. It ended with the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, a genuine and world-historic achievement. But the promise of full equality that briefly flickered during the Reconstruction era that followed, black men voting, holding office, building schools and institutions across the former Confederacy, was systematically dismantled within roughly a decade. Federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877 as part of a political bargain to resolve a disputed presidential election, and in the vacuum that followed, former Confederate states enacted black codes and later Jim Crow laws that reimposed rigid racial hierarchy through segregation, disenfranchisement, and terroristic violence, including thousands of lynchings carried out with near-total impunity over the following decades. The nation that told itself a story of steady moral progress toward liberty had, within a single generation of ending slavery, constructed an entire parallel legal system to preserve racial subordination in a new form, a fact American popular memory would spend the better part of a century minimizing, softening, or omitting from mainstream historical education entirely. Even as the South underwent this brutal retrenchment, the reunified nation turned its expansionist energy outward and westward with renewed force. The decades after the Civil War saw the near-total military subjugation of the Plains nations, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Apache, and dozens of others, through a combination of direct warfare, the deliberate near-extermination of the buffalo herds that Plains cultures depended on for survival, and forced relocation onto reservations. This period is often remembered in popular American culture through the romantic imagery of cowboys, cavalry, and the winning of the West, a phrase that, again, frames a sustained campaign of conquest and displacement as an inevitable, almost natural process rather than a series of deliberate policy choices broken treaties, and military campaigns, culminating in atrocities such as the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, where U.S. cavalry killed between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children. By the close of the 19th century, the physical frontier the nation had been expanding into for 300 years was, in the words of the U.S. Census Bureau's own 1890 report, effectively closed. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner responded with his hugely influential frontier thesis in 1893, arguing that the existence of open frontier land had been the defining force shaping American democracy, individualism, and character, and now openly wondering what would replace it as an outlet for national energy. The answer arrived within a few short years: overseas expansion. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain, ostensibly over Cuban independence and inflamed by a press eager for conflict. The sinking of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor, later attributed most likely to an internal accident rather than Spanish sabotage, was nonetheless blamed on Spain and used to justify war. The brief conflict left the United States in control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and effectively in control of Cuba, the country's first sustained ventures into overseas colonial administration, a fact in tension with a national self-image built entirely around anti-colonial revolution against Britain. The occupation of the Philippines in particular required a brutal multi-year war against Filipino independence fighters, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, a conflict scarcely remembered in American popular history despite its scale, precisely because it fits so awkwardly into a national narrative organized around liberation rather than colonization. The early 20th century brought industrial transformation at a scale the founders could never have imagined. Railroads, steel, oil, mass immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe that swelled American cities, and vast fortunes concentrated in the hands of industrialists like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan. Alongside labor conditions so severe they sparked repeated violent strikes and, gradually, a progressive reform movement seeking to rein in corporate power and expand democratic
participation.
When war engulfed Europe in 1914, the United States initially maintained neutrality, entering only in 1917 after German submarine warfare and the intercepted Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. American intervention arrived late in the war but proved decisive in tipping the exhausted European combatants toward Allied victory, and President Woodrow Wilson emerged from the peace conference at Versailles proclaiming a new vision of international order built around self-determination and collective security through his proposed League of Nations. The bitter irony, seldom emphasized in American retellings of this idealistic moment, is that the United States Senate itself rejected membership in the League Wilson had championed, retreating into a period of relative isolationism even as the seeds of the next, far larger global conflict were being planted in the punitive terms imposed on defeated Germany. The interwar years brought the Great Depression, beginning with the 1929 stock market crash and deepening into the worst economic collapse in American history, with unemployment reaching roughly 25% at its peak. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal fundamentally and permanently expanded the role of the federal government in American economic life: Social Security, labor protections, banking regulation, public works. A transformation so significant that it effectively created the modern American state, even as it was implemented in practice in ways that frequently excluded Black Americans from its full benefits through compromises made to secure the support of segregationist Southern Democrats in Congress. By the time war returned to Europe in 1939, the United States again sought to remain uninvolved, providing material support to Britain through the Lend-Lease program while avoiding direct combat, until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, killed over 2,000 Americans and brought the country fully into the Second World War. What followed was the mobilization of the entire American economy and society at a scale never before or since seen in the nation's history, transforming the United States, largely spared the direct physical devastation inflicted on Europe and Asia, into the preeminent industrial and military power on Earth by the war's end in 1945. It is at this exact moment, victorious, physically untouched, its economy the only major industrial power left standing at full strength, holding sole possession of atomic weapons after the devastating bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the story of America shifts registers entirely. The nation that had spent its first century and a half absorbing a continent through conquest, fighting a war over its own original sin, and only fitfully engaging the wider world, now stood, almost by historical accident as much as design, as the most powerful state the world had ever known. The story it would tell about that power, and the story the world would be told about America in turn, is where the next chapter of this history begins.